Great. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to start now on our session for today, which is on opening government. So before I begin, and just I want to say this from the outset, you'll get the most out of the session if you're able to, if you're willing to interact and ask questions and such. Some of those questions I'll deal with as I go on, and some of them I'll keep to the end. But really, please don't be shy. There aren't any like stupid questions or anything like that. Whether you're a fresher or like a fourth year, it doesn't matter. If you do have a question, please do ask that. So to kick off in that stead, before I begin, what do people find difficult about opening government at the moment? Because if there's nothing, then we can all just go to the dirty down. Yeah.
There's a huge lack of rebuttal scopes. Essentially, there's no rebuttal that you can do, and that leads to a lot of material loss throughout the debate. Mm-hmm. Essentially, that is one of the problems I face specifically.
Okay, awesome. So I will answer this question properly throughout, but like in a nutshell, and if I forget to, please flag it. The answer to that is trying to preempt what the arguments are going to be made on the opposite side later down the table, and one, preemptively dealing with those with your own material, and also insulating your own material against rebuttals from the other side. Yeah.
So you're also sort of trying to sort of shape the debate, I guess, because you're sort of setting the background for the government's argument, things like that. So if you do poorly, then like the rest of the government members kind of, it's more difficult.
Yeah, you're completely right. You do want to shape the debate, and what we'll think about, what we'll talk about is how we can best like maximise our ability to control the debate, so that we're going to finish first or second in nearly all circumstances. Excellent. Yeah.
How to make sure that the mechanisms, if you need a mechanism in the debate, is one, well developed enough, and second, if it's watertight, like how do you check that you have missed something obvious?
Excellent. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult to work out if it's watertight until opening up, get up. But we will discuss that. Yeah, so I'll take one here and then one back.
So the problem I have is especially with low impact or very abstract motions, I cannot properly frame them on the opening government, which leads then to the discussion being messy and arguments not really correlating with each other.
Okay, do you have an example of a motion?
Like the Euros motion, this House believes that Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra should play with Wagner. Is one of the examples of such motions.
Yeah, that is a difficult one. And the benefit about being an opening government on a shallow motion is there's usually always something to say. There's just not usually enough for closing government or closing opposition to say. So it's about identifying, okay, what two arguments are there in this particular round, and making those. And sometimes you just have to acknowledge the debate's not really going to be about massive impacts. So that particular debate is an example of that. And what you want to do is almost acknowledge that, and then just say, but to the extent there is an impact either way on this motion, here are some like detailed reasons for why the impact's going to be positive or negative.
My question is, how do you properly split the substantive between PM and DPM? Because so far the strategy, has been to say everything in the PM and then fill the holes in the DPM by rebuttal.
Okay, so we will discuss this, but as a summary, what I'd say is your PM speech should be able to win the debate by itself. What I mean by that is it shouldn't be like a hung case. Like you shouldn't have to wait till the second speech to understand how this is going to work, because the first speech is just talked about like as principled reason why we should do this. Yeah, so your first speech should be able to stand alone, but the second speech's job is about one, adding a new argument, but 2, 3, and 4 are separate things: framing, rebuttal, and comparative. So we will discuss that. But it's a very good question, because that's one of the hardest things to work out in opening government, like the spread of material. I saw a hand down here somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, was this sort of a lack of prep time, I suppose?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. I actually haven't, although I'm wary this is being recorded, I haven't shouted in my usual spiel about how to maximize use of prep time. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. So we will discuss that afterwards. Anything else? No. Okay, great. So I'm glad, because thankfully, what I'm going to talk to you about now hopefully should cover all of those things. And if it doesn't, please do flag, and we can talk about that separately in more detail. So what I want to do, though, is to start with just a general comment about opening government, because I remember, even in my third year, I was still quite scared of opening government. Like when I drew opening government, I was like, oh, especially if it was in round 4 of a 4-round tournament. And that, I think, came out of the idea that, you know, we had the least amount of time before we had to get up and speak. And that's where my worry came from. But the most important thing to remember about opening government is that it gives you the greatest control of the debate, because you're going to dictate where this debate's going to go, by and large. And secondly, you are the first team in the round who can get up and just make the obvious arguments for this motion well, right? Closing government have to come up with new stuff, or have to look at what you haven't explained and explain that. And then the op teams are kind of having to compete based on what arguments you make. So opening government in many ways actually it is the easiest position in the round, at least to guarantee a second. Sometimes you might lose to closing opposition, and there's not like a massive amount you can always do about that, but you should generally be able to beat opening opposition and definitely closing government, because by and large, unfortunately, most motions are quite shallow, so there isn't a huge amount of material on the government bench, which means that closing government, if an opening government team does like quite a good job, it is disproportionately difficult to beat them. So with that in mind, let's start talking about what you do before the motion's announced. Okay, so you know the draw goes up, and you find out you're in opening government. The first thing to do is not to panic, right? And to remind yourselves of what I've just said. Is great, opening government, right? We can dictate this debate. We can get up and make the most obvious arguments well, and we can ensure that we're going to come at least second, but probably win this round, right? Remind yourself of that. After that, what I'd say, and I actually don't do this all that often, but when I have done it, I found it very useful, and I think it's especially useful in opening government, is to start doing some kind of exercise between you and your partner that gets your mind thinking, right, in like a debatory way. Whether that be, all right, let's come up with arguments for, you know, random motion X, or, okay, what do we think this motion is based on the music that's playing when the round goes up, which is usually a clue about what the motion is. Okay, what could it be? Okay, let's just like start coming up with some arguments for that. Because something that I think a lot of people struggle with, I certainly did, and do when I occasionally step back into the rounds, is going from, you know, sitting around and doing nothing, waiting for the draw, and then the motion's announced and you're in opening government, and then suddenly having to come up with arguments, right? Because my brain usually takes like a little while to like kick into gear, and when you only have 15 minutes before you're meant to start speaking, that's the problem. So if you've kind of already started thinking about arguments, even if they're completely irrelevant to the round, your mind is in gear essentially, and that can be really helpful. So that's the second thing I'd do after not panicking. And then the third thing is more just like a logistical thing, to be honest, especially if you're at a tournament, is if you're an opening government, you found out you're an opening government and you've got your details, make your way towards a door. Because what you don't want to do, especially at bigger tournaments where there are lots of people, is you don't want to lose 2 minutes or 3 minutes having to like exit the room because everyone else has got ahead of you. Because again, this is something I find, I can't necessarily say I speak for everyone, but I know a lot of people suffer from this as well, is I don't really prep very well when I'm trying to like do something else, in this case like leave the room. Yep. So it's a logistical thing, you get the motion, you can write it down, you can leave with your partner and you're already on your way. Yep. So little things, but actually if you start adding up the time that we're saving and all of these things, we're talking, you know, potentially 3 minutes or so, which is a fifth of your time. Grand. Okay, so now the motion's announced, you've written it down, and you're leaving the room. The first thing you should do is what do we think? What should you do on any motion after it's announced? Yeah.
Why are we debating on this motion?
Okay, before we get there, but you're right, we should think about that. Something far more straightforward. Yeah.
think about all the words in the motion and how we understand them, how can we define them, what they imply?
Close. So I'm thinking this may not have happened to anyone here yet, but it definitely happened to me. So my first year, I spoke with the president of the society at the time, Gareth Williams, and we were in opening opposition on the motion, info slide, blah, 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 blah. This house would not take the pill being like something that keeps you alive forever. I'm leader of opposition, we're in the round, we're very confident. You know, we've got some good arguments, we're ready to go. Prime Minister starts talking, about 30 seconds in, I'm suspicious. Minute in, I'm really suspicious. Look around, no one else is perturbed, and Gareth's writing his own notes down. I turn to Gareth, I'm like, Gareth, why is the Prime Minister saying what I was going to say? And worked out that obviously we'd misread the motion, we hadn't seen the word not in it, we'd prepped the wrong side, right? You don't want to do that. You don't want to have to get up and pretty much say your speech and then go, and the reason that's not true is, and then make things up on the spot, which is essentially what had to happen. So the first thing you should always do, doesn't matter what round it's in, I did this, you know, World's Final, Euro Semi, whatever, you definitely don't want to be getting it wrong there anyway, but whatever round you're in, the first thing you should do with your partner is, once you've taken a second or not to just acknowledge what you're doing, is just check. Just to confirm, we will be arguing in favour of X, right? Yes, that is what we're doing, right? And then you go off into your silent prayer. It takes a split second, but trust me, the one time you get it wrong, it will be costly. So I would strongly recommend you just check with your partner what side of the motion you're on, and you know that we're talking about. You're talking about the same thing. Excellent. Okay. After that is we want to go into silent preparation. Everyone's different, of course, and teams operate differently, but I would say on top half, you want to take maybe 3 minutes or so, silent prep, possibly 4, but not really a huge amount longer than that. And let's have a think about what we'll be doing in that silent preparation. So what do people currently do when they're prepping silently? What are we thinking about? What's the first thing we should think about? You were very close to what I would say on this. The first thing I would think about, sorry, yeah, please.
What's the bigger question?
What do you mean?
This debate is one. There's an overarching theme within the debate that the debate is framed within, and so you should frame your argument as it.
Agreed, definitely. So yes, we should be looking to debate within like the sphere of like why this motion's been set kind of attitude. Excellent. But what specifically do you want to work out? Yeah.
Looking at the active words in the motion, things like actors, people involved, stakeholders, etc.
Okay, before you get to that, excellent, you're right. But before you get to that, what should you work out? So you've worked out what side of the motion you're on. Before you start coming up with arguments, because that's what you're talking about there, like actors, what do you want to do in between?
I always find that every debate effectively can be broken down into A is better than B, and so some debate topics are really wordy, and so I sort of reduce it down to that and then break it into components like A is good because, and B is bad because.
Okay, excellent. I think we're hopefully when I say the following things, you will go, oh yes, of course we do that. We just call it something else. But I'm infamous for being very anal about this. The thing you should definitely do before you get to anything else when you come up with arguments is work out what do we need to prove in this debate? What are our burdens? Yeah? Looking around, hopefully seeing, yes, of course, yes, burdens, yes. So what do I mean by burdens?
Sort of like the things that your argument kind of rests on, so you need to sort of prove that they're true for your argument.
Other way around.
Other way around.
Yeah? Because you see how if you misidentify what you're trying to prove and you make arguments, even if you prove them excellently, they can get beat very easily. Yeah? Because you've not proven the most important thing in the debate. So let's take a motion. What did you guys debate last Friday in session? or last Wednesday? What was the last sensible motion anyone in here debated?
This House would introduce an unconditional minimum income.
Minimum income? Okay.
Living, yeah, something. Replacing like...
So the basic income.
Alright, let's yeah, okay, so universal basic income, right? Fine. So universal basic income, this House would introduce a universal basic income. Before you start making your arguments, if you work out what we need to prove in that round, you'll be infinitely more likely, well not infinitely, you'll be substantially more likely to win that round, okay? So what kinds of things do we think we need to prove in that debate? From opening government, or closing government for that matter.
I think it's just replacement for benefit structure, right?
Yeah.
Benefit
Yeah.
structure.
Yeah,
Essentially-
don't worry about that one,
Yeah.
but just imagine it's just this House would introduce universal basic income. What do we need to prove?
So that is,
Yeah, so one here and then one for
that
that.
essentially means that there's going to be a change of status quo, and why is there a requirement of status quo change in the first place? If there's status quo change, how is it benefiting the people who are going to be affected by it? And then prove that the new world that is going to be created because of that change is essentially better than the first world.
Okay, so that was a lot of burdens put together. So let's just split them out, right? Because the reason I'm going to spend a bit of time on this is because if you can understand this well, everything else becomes substantially easier. How many times in a round have you been told that what you've proved just is less important than something else? Right? I assume quite frequently. And the reason that is either your judge is poor or another team has explained why their thing's more important, or more likely, you've just not explained something that is as important as something else in this particular round. So the reason I'm asking to split them out is just so we can see clearly what each one is. So can someone name one of the burdens for me in this round that we'll have to prove on government at some point? Yeah. Sorry, yeah, I did say I'd come to you and then I'd go to you. Yeah.
Just what the status quo is and why not change to benefits.
So what did you say
What
afterwards?
the status quo is and then why we should change it or why.
Okay, great. So I would say, yeah, what is bad in the status quo? Because what's the first thing you try and do in opening opposition on any motion really? Is you try and explain that this policy is unnecessary, yeah, because the status quo is not that bad, or is positive, yeah? Excellent. We want to show why the status quo is negative. What else do we want to show? Yeah.
Why do main stakeholders benefit from the policy?
Grand, yeah. Yeah, I'm just trying to think if there's something if that falls under something. But no, certainly at some point we're going to have to prove that the main stakeholders. But you see how when we get to main stakeholders, that's a question, right? Like who are the main stakeholders? What else do we think we need to prove?
Why the motion would create a better status quo? Like, how would the improvement happen?
Excellent, yeah. So there's two things there. Why a universal basic income would be better than the status quo. That was the second thing that was linked to that.
How it would come about.
Excellent, and we'll talk about that. That's like a sub-component, but an incredibly important one which people forget, which is mechanisms by which the thing you're talking about actually works. So what I mean by that in this context of this round is nearly everyone in opening government will say, we're going to give people money, yeah? And then they will also say at some point, this money will make their lives better, and then they'll probably talk about why their lives being better is a good thing. But an important thing which will often be forgotten is how giving people this universal basic income on a day-to-day basis actually leads them to be happier, right? What do they do with that money? Talking about, okay, now someone can have the opportunity, for example, to learn, to educate themselves more because they're not worried about like having to earn some money in order to feed themselves or have somewhere to live. And then talking in detail about how that actually works. Or now, someone's able to not be forced to do a job for like 16 hours a day, which they hate, but which they can't really leave because as soon as they leave, they're in a situation where they don't have enough money to survive on a daily basis, etc., etc. What's the other big question that we're going to find with universal basic income from the opposition?
Cost.
Sorry?
Cost.
Yeah, excellent. So it's actually, those two. I was like, yeah, you're definitely right. Cost, and what else? Yeah.
How they could spend the money negatively and the impact it can have on people.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think when we explain on our side that they're going to spend the money sensibly and positively, we're trying to beat that argument, right? So yeah, excellent. What else? What's the issue? I'm a taxpayer now, right? Okay, I work very, very hard, 5+ days a week, for many, many hours, sometimes, and I pay taxes. Yeah. Why is it that someone like me might get annoyed if we're handing out universal basic income?
So spending my money, I don't want to because there's no control or regulation, they're just giving them their money and they use it out.
Yeah, because it's unconditional and there's no restraints, right? So what question will we have to answer? I'm looking at the 3 people, one of whom has a nice Apple Air. What do you guys think? What do we need to prove?
It's you, Gloria.
No, it's any one of you 3. So what do we think we need to say? If the opposition are going to argue that this seems unfair to just hand people money which they've not earned and taking it away from people who have worked possibly hard for it, what will we have to prove on the government? Exactly. Why it's fair. Brilliant. Right? So some of these burdens are going to be easier than others to prove. But do you see how if we don't do all of them, we can get beat immediately by an opposition team who makes one of those arguments very well? Yeah? So if they go up and go, look, we do think people will spend the money well. We agree the status quo is bad, but this is fundamentally unfair. They can still beat you if you've not explained why it's fair. Equally, if you've explained why it's fair and why the status quo is bad, but you've not explained why people will use this money sensibly, and someone gets up and goes, here's why people will waste all of this money, and like everyone in general gets poorer. It doesn't matter that the status quo is bad, because they're arguing it gets worse, and it doesn't matter that it's a legitimate policy, because it doesn't lead to anything positive, right? So, unfortunately, this is a tough prop, right? Which is why I think we identified 4, maybe 4.5 burdens. But do you see how now? So now, if you imagine you're in prep, and hopefully that's taken a little bit quicker than we've taken, and it will get quicker with time, I promise. We've identified those 4 things. We can now narrow our thinking to prove those arguments, right? Because if we started the other way around and we start with arguments, and then we only subsequently work out they're not relevant, we've just wasted a lot of time on arguments we're never actually going to be able to use successfully anyway. Yeah? So you've clarified the motion in prep, when the motion's announced. You've gone into silent prep, and you should then identify and write down what you think the burdens are, and then you should move on to try and come up with arguments for those burdens. And then also any arguments that come to mind from the other side, because they'll probably be trying to disprove your burdens. Yeah? Great. Okay, so you've had that discussion. You've had that silent preparation, and you should also, think about, all right, how on earth are we going to deal with this? Which happens sometimes, right? You have a motion and you go, all right, how on earth are we going to defend this? And you want to flag that, because then when you start talking, these are the issues you want to discuss. So initially, you want to clarify with your partner, okay, what do we think we need to prove? Reach agreement on that. Then you will implicitly or explicitly decide, all right, how much time are we going to spend on each of those? And then you can actually get to the arguments. What I would say, this is something which, like I said, this may vary. In opening government, it was helpful actually, once you've agreed all of those things, to then just start writing the Prime Minister's speech, and you can start talking through together. So, you could go, okay, first argument, why the status quo is bad. What do you guys think on this motion? How much of your 7-minute speech, assuming the model here actually is quite complicated, so it might take, say, a minute, of your 6 minutes, do you think you should spend explaining why the status quo is bad on this motion? Yeah.
20 seconds.
Okay, got 20. Higher or lower?
Higher.
Yeah? I'd agree. This is subjective, right? Don't worry.
Maybe just that first 10 minute of the speech.
Yeah. Okay, so about a minute. I actually have got myself into a bit of a hole here because I'm not sure on this particular one. I would say, I actually think you would have to spend a reasonable amount of time on this motion to explain why the status quo is bad, because if you can explain in this situation, or to be honest, in many situations, if you can explain why the status quo is bad, when it's unlikely, if you explain why the status quo is bad, you can always push back on op who don't offer a counter proposal by saying, look, at least we're trying to do something here, and then prove why that's beneficial. The reason I think you might have to do a bit more work here, so about probably a minute, maybe a minute and a half even, is if you can create buy-in that the status quo is so legitimately unfair, and I think here you can argue very persuasively that it is, it then actually ends up supporting your arguments. And what I mean by that is, let's have a think about the kind of reasons we're going to talk about. We're going to say, for example, it's very unfair that people are forced through the threat of starvation or homelessness to take incredibly difficult, very poorly paid jobs which they don't enjoy, but they're forced to take those jobs because they know if they don't do that, they're not going to have enough money to have somewhere to live, or have enough food, or to have any basic access to the nicer things we like to do with money, like entertainment and go out with family and friends and stuff, right? If we can persuade people that that is unfair, that people are being forced to do that, it's not a big jump to then go, how do we solve that problem? Or we solve it by guaranteeing everyone a basic level of income. Do we see that? So actually in this particular motion, there's a very clear link between what the problem is and how this solves it. Other times, for example, so say the motion was this House would send ground troops to Syria. How much time do we think we need to spend on the status quo being bad there? Why is that?
Everyone kind of knows that it's not something we need to go
Yeah, I agree. And the question there is kind of going to be, does this improve a horrible situation, as opposed to someone getting up and going on op? It's not that bad, right? That's unlikely. However, there, whilst I completely agree, I wouldn't spend a huge amount of time on it. I'll try and build up rhetorically why it's so important that we do something immediately, right? And we'll discuss that in a second. So there are differences. So it's not always about time. It's about, we can create, say, a sense of urgency without spending a huge amount of time on it. Yeah?
I think especially in that motion, it's more, you don't have to explain that there is a problem, but rather you have to characterize the problem that you want to solve. So, like, some people in that motion would say, like, we've intervened to fight against the IS, or we intervened to fight against Assad. It makes a bit of a difference whether you're fighting like a terrorist organization or a proper government.
No, that's a very good point, exactly. It's about, of course, every argument you make should be helping your overall goal. So yeah, of course, if your prop is that you're going to invade on the side of Assad, you need to set up the problem being not Assad. Of course, yeah, definitely. Excellent. Okay, so writing the PM speech. So how does this work? So the first thing I guess to acknowledge is what is this PM speech going to look like at the end? Yeah? How is it going to look like when you deliver it? So the first thing that you like to be aware of, I think, is that PM speech, like we've discussed, should be able to win the debate by itself. So it should make attempts to fulfill all of the burdens that exist, right? Even if, like in the case of universal basic income, it's going to be very difficult in 5 or 7 minutes to fulfill all of those sufficiently. You need to at least make an argument or some arguments towards all of them. Yeah. So usually a PM speech will have 3, possibly 4 arguments. Yeah, but usually 3 actually, I would say. And that will help you when you write notes, because I would recommend very much have a single page of paper for each argument. Yeah, so like, argument 1, and then you have your page, argument 2, argument 3. the reason that's useful, apart from for yourself when delivering your speech, is it also helps your partner know what you're going to say. They can fill out some like analysis for you by just taking a sheet of paper and things of that nature. The thing is, though, what you want to do is your PM structure will broadly be the following. In a 7-minute speech, you'll want to build up momentum by setting the scene in the first 20-30 seconds. Yeah, because what you're doing is you're changing the world in some way. You know, sometimes if it's a marginal debate, you're not changing it very much, if at all. And if we're sending ground troops to Syria, that is a very big thing, which could potentially have like huge impacts and huge repercussions. So you should embrace that in the first 20-30 seconds of your PM speech, and you can use that to build up momentum for why this policy is necessary. Yeah. So that can be a number of things. You'll probably want to explain in that time why the status quo is so bad, right? You know, like if you can pick one thing of what's going on and illustrate that using using rhetoric, why that's so damaging, do that. You'll also want to explain why we need to act now, but then you'll resubstantiate that in your argument. So that will broadly be your first 30 seconds. After that, depending on what motion it is, you'll have a mechanism. Yeah? Because sometimes you won't really need a mechanism, you'll just have to broadly clarify what you're talking about, if it's say this House believes a motion. But if it's invasion or universal basic income, there's going to be a lot of things you're going to want to talk about in your mech, right? So that's what you're going to set out there. And then you'll be into argument 1, then argument 2, then argument 3, and then briefly just reiterate, like, I wouldn't actually repeat what the 3 arguments were, to be honest. I just repeat, like, if there's one single big issue that you're talking about, why you need to do this now, repeat that, okay? So now we have a broad idea of what the speech is going to look like. How do we actually move towards, you know, putting that together in a positive way in prep? So, what do people currently do when they're writing the PM speech in prep time? Yeah. Yeah.
Have lots and lots of course links. This goes to this, goes to this, goes to this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And do you discuss that as a team? Like, do you push each other on it?
Not enough.
Yeah. No, that's fine. No, that's fine. Excellent. What else do you do? Yeah.
I literally just divide a piece of paper and then write like screaming arguments for and like obvious arguments against, just to give some context of what we need to say and what we need to prevent the other people, the opposition, from being able to say in the first place. Okay, excellent.
Yeah, so that for example, a lot of that will come in your silent prep, right? So then you will have that brief discussion before you start writing, but then you go, okay, fine. Listen, the first thing we need to do is explain why the status quo is bad. What I'll do then is I'll just check with my partner, because I usually speak second. I check with my partner, all right, how comfortable are you with like the analysis on this particular thing? But sometimes I'll go, I know this, right? Like, and then you go, great, okay. So then you don't need to spend a huge amount of time, which there's a limited amount already, talking through that particular argument. Yeah. So what my view on it is, you want to be in a position where you've at least put down the headings of what you're going to talk about, right? As a bare minimum by the time you get up. You don't want to get up where you've kind of like written out beautifully your first 3.5 minutes of your speech, but then your last 3.5 minutes you've just got nothing, right? That's worse than having to come up with some stuff like without notes. Yeah? So my view on this, and like I said, everyone's different, but like my view is, first thing to do is kind of, okay, let's go through and like headline what our arguments and sub-arguments are broadly going to be for our burdens. Yeah? So burden and subsequently argument 1, why the status quo is bad. We're in universal basic income. So I'd go, okay, on my piece of paper, if I was speaking PM, I'd split it into like 2 halves. So like bullet point 1, and I'd put forced to take jobs due to threat of poverty. Yeah. Bullet point 2, deprived from opportunity to move up social ladder due to threat of poverty. Okay, right? And then, we go, all right, we'll come back to this, but move on. Okay? Second argument. Why giving people universal basic income gives them freedom. Bullet point 1, guaranteed basic level of safety net. 2, provides opportunity to take on, new experiences. 3, can pay for, things which are going to benefit them in the long term brackets, like e.g. education, comma, like, adventure trip or whatever, right? Because actually you can still make arguments on that basis. Okay, great. 3, how people will spend this money or something, and then like 4, why this is like better off. One of them should be like legitimate. But do you see the point being, you go through and you want to just jot your like broad headings for each of your arguments, because then what you can do once you've got that done is you then, between the two of you, can start writing your analysis down. Yeah. And worst case scenario, you run out of time before you get to write your analysis down on your third or fourth argument. At least the Prime Minister has the headlines, right, of each sub-argument, which they can then get up and deliver. Then a scenario that we've discussed already where they're not able to do that. Does that make sense? Any questions at this point? Yeah.
How long should our arguments be if we take into account the fact that we're supposed to make 3 of them? I've never actually managed to do so many in one speech.
Yeah, so I think we need to be critical with ourselves about like what we're actually saying. And what I mean by that is each argument, and this is tangential to, which is not tangential, it's a complete separate topic, but it's a very good question, so I'll answer it now, hopefully rather succinctly. Every argument you make will broadly follow the same structure, right? Which is, why is it true? Why is it relevant? And why is it more important than something else? Yeah? And that's a comparative, that last bit. Actually, what happens more often than not, if you actually play back someone's speech, is it kind of flip-flops between all of those, and it often is quite repetitive. Yeah? So if you think about arguments in that way, you will find that even speaking at, for example, this pace, you'll be able to make 3 well-developed arguments in a speech because you're cutting down on repetition. Like the next time you speak or you watch someone in a round, just try and gauge how much that speech is repetitive. How often are they essentially proving the same thing again, or are they literally saying, the same thing again, sometimes in slightly different language? The answer will be quite often. Yeah? So if we think about making arguments in that structure and sticking to it, we can massively reduce the time we need to spend on an argument. Yeah.
So, talking of sort of efficiency with time, I noticed that quite a few people start off their speeches by saying, firstly, I'm going to talk about this, then prove why this and this, and then finally end with that.
Yeah.
Doing that mini intro summary, would you say that's a good thing because it makes it clear to the judges what you're going to say,
Yeah.
Or is that sort of...
It's a really good question. But in the last year of my proper debating career, I dropped that, and I banked on the fact that I was clear enough during my speech that people could follow what I was saying, and especially in 5-minute speeches that saved a tenth of my time, because you're right, it takes about 30 seconds to lay that out at the start. Honestly, however, I would still do that if I were most people at this stage, just because in a lot of debates you're not going to need all of your 7 minutes to make completely new arguments, but what you will need is to make sure the judges are on side immediately, because the key thing about that flagging does is you want to do enough that the judges know what you're going to talk about, and what you're trying to do there is not just make it easier for them to remember what you said in their notes subsequently, but they go, oh yes, they said these 3 things. What you're also trying to do, and those hopefully all of you have had a chance to judge already, when a speaker gets up and tells you what they're going to say, you're already implicitly making a judgment about where they're going to fall in this round, right? Like when teams get up and flag their arguments to me, I'm like, okay, yeah, this is broadly, what I was expecting, or broadly, yeah, this I can see how this is going to fit in. It's not to say that if I'm like, well, what the hell are they talking about here, that they can't subsequently win that round, but at least, you know, I know broadly where it's going. The other benefit it does give, and this is why I think it is really important, especially in like the early stages of one's debate career, is when we're still developing like how clear we are during a speech, it's very helpful for the judges to know what you're trying to say before, you know, like, because you've already told them like what the headline is. So it's like, if you're like, okay, my first argument is going to be why this improves the lives of people, and then you go off on a slight tangent on an argument and the judge is a little bit confused as to what you're talking about, they know that you're trying to prove this, so then it makes it easier for them to comprehend that. But what I would say is, so hopefully that explains like the justification about like, so the nutshell is, yes, you should still do it, but I would do it as follows. My first argument is going to be why the status quo is so terrible. My second argument is going to be why this policy is legitimate. Thirdly, I'm going to explain why people will use this money we give them usefully. And fourthly, I'm going to explain why this is better than the status quo. But I wouldn't then like, that's all I would do, right? Too many people for somehow, and it has happened in nearly all the debates I judge, end up dragging that out for a minute before they get to anything particularly useful. So that's all you have to do, right? That took about 12 seconds probably, and that was 4 arguments, yeah? So actually it doesn't take a huge amount of time, so yeah, I would do it. But you're definitely right to flag that a lot of people waste time there. Okay? Right. So we were discussing how we actually now, so we have an idea of how our partnership works in terms of writing a PM speech, and we have an idea of like how we're going to set it out. But what questions do we ask each other when we actually come up with the analysis? Yep.
So why is the point relevant firstly, and then if the point is relevant, what sort of counter reaction can you get from the opposition which needs to be rebutted from a speech essentially? Those will be the 2 points for every single proposition that we come with, and essentially will be a long process for the speech.
Excellent. Yeah.
Why is that important?
Excellent, yeah. And like, so starting with the why that's important. This is, you know, we used to play like the why game, right? Like in training, is you just keep pushing each other until you get to like a conclusion which you don't really need to justify. And that's important because, again, I'm sure all of you have been in a position where you've made an argument, it gets challenged, you know what the answer to that challenge is and what else you could have said that would have like dealt with it, but you can't speak anymore, and then you have to sit and you have to wait, and then someone else gets to say it, and then, you know, next thing you know, you're third or fourth, right? So the way to prevent that happening is you want to do that yourselves. So, you know, like, as you're talking with your partner, when they're writing it down, they'll be like, okay, and then we're going to say this, and then one of you will go, okay, but why does that happen, blah, blah, blah. All right, but why will you say they're going to spend it on education, but why won't they just go out to the movies or whatever? Oh, because blah, blah, blah. But also, let's just say, even if they do spend it on or go to the movies, we don't care, that's a perfectly legitimate decision because blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, great, cool. All right, and then, you know, so you want to challenge yourselves, right? And you need to be, you know, you have to acknowledge at the start of any debate partnership that, you know, sometimes it can be a bit annoying, right? When someone just like, you're kind of like telling each other that your argument isn't very good. But that's not really what you're doing. You're just trying to work together to maximize how effective it is. Excellent. The other things you want to consider are things such as the following.
So this question is really that if during prep we have played a wide game, we know the whole of the analysis, but we do have enough substantial to be more. What I'm saying is, if I don't have the time to pre-but, should I switch?
Why don't you have time to pre-but?
Because I have more analysis to go to instead of pre-but.
So it's not a zero-sum game, right? Because, sorry, we actually shouldn't. So when we say pre-but, when I say pre-but, what I don't mean is the following. Opening up will probably get up and tell you X. The response to that is Y. Instead, you deal with it as follows. So for example, we know on the universal basic income that they're going to get up and say it's unfair, right? If they don't, they've really missed something there. So you can get up in Prime Minister and go, look, let's be crystal clear about something. We don't we think we completely acknowledge that we are having to take, we're suggesting we take money from others who've worked for that money, right? We're not shying away from that. But let's have a look at who needs that money more in this current position. In our scenario, we're telling you that the people who we're going to give the money to at the moment face the following problems. Blah, 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 blah. They're literally on the verge of having to decide whether they have somewhere to sleep and have food on the table, but do a job which they're going to be stuck with sometimes for the rest of their lives, or be in a situation where they give up that job on the hope, on the chance that they may get something better, but risk losing everything that they own and everything that makes life valuable. In exchange, to prevent people having that, what we're saying is, yes, we do tax these people a little bit more, right? Yes, it might mean that instead of being able to go on that additional holiday every year, they don't. Potentially that means that instead of like being able to save up for a second home after 20 years, it takes 25. But we're okay with that trade-off because, and then you explain why one group matters more than the other. So that, for me, is what I mean by pre-rebuttal. What you're doing is you're undercutting their argument before they've even made it, but you're not explicitly saying X and Y. But also, do you see how it's helping your argument, right? Because you're explaining why these people are needy. So I wouldn't see it so much as a trade-off in terms of, okay, do I sacrifice my own material? To the extent that is, you're right, of course I can make a fifth argument instead of doing that. But that's where you need to decide as a team what's more important. And nearly always, dealing with the most important arguments from the op is going to be more important than making your fourth or fifth argument, right? Because it's about marginal returns, yeah? If you beat their most important argument, that's going to do more for your case than adding like a fourth argument, which is just less important, because otherwise it wouldn't be fourth, yeah? But the other things you want to consider at different points are things like, okay, what are we sacrificing? This is the biggest problem in Gov, I find, which is people don't acknowledge that there's an op. And then, so PM gets up, gives the speech where if you listen to, you're like, yeah, this is perfect, this is great. And then the leader of op gets up, and then you're like, oh, of course, yeah, there's an op to this. This is a terrible idea. Because they've not acknowledged it at all. But when you almost like acknowledge, and you are already doing that comparison in a Prime Minister's speech, when the op get up, it's far less powerful when you've already, in order for them to get their argument in a position where it's successful, they have to knock your argument off, right? Rather than if you haven't said anything at all about what they're going to talk about. So always think, what are we sacrificing? And explain in the Prime Minister's speech why we're okay with sacrificing that, yeah? So in the case of invasion, the big sacrifice is going to be that, we may kill civilian lives, right? So of course, in your first speech, you should say something like, look, we obviously take the lives of civilians in any scenario incredibly highly. We don't put anything above that, actually. But the reason we're saying we still need to go and send troops on the ground is because every single day we don't do anything, civilians are being slaughtered, they are being tortured, they are losing their lives in huge numbers already. So we completely agree that we want to save civilian lives. Our case is that we save more on our side, right? And that then undercuts opening up, and they go, oh, you're going to kill civilian lives. The judge is like, yeah, they know, they've already explained. Do you see what I mean? Yeah? So always think, what are we sacrificing, and deal with that in advance. Other things you want to think about is linked to that, which is, can we flip the most important argument on the other side in some way? Or not necessarily the most important, but an argument on the other side. So, for example, in that debate about universal basic income, op may say, oh, people are going to spend their money on like entertainment and stuff. You go, good, right? These people, not only do these people deserve this, but actually it probably will help the rest of their lives and make them a more fulfilling, a bigger contributor to the rest of society if they're actually happy and have like a social life, right? So actually, yeah, this is a great thing. Do you see how we can deal with things there as well? Okay, I'm conscious of time as well, so what I want to discuss is I want to discuss models, and then I want to discuss briefly, but hopefully succinctly and in detail, what a Deputy Prime Minister's speech should do, yeah? So models, what a model is used for is to supplement your own arguments, right? So you shouldn't be trying to win a debate with your model. You should be trying to use it to support the arguments you're making. So what a model should do is get rid of anything obviously bad, which is also unnecessary, right? So what I mean by this is, imagine that you're trying to reintroduce corporal punishment in schools, so hitting children. You don't need to hit children in public, in front of the other school kids. You don't need them to be hit by the teachers. You don't need to hit them so hard that they bleed or they bruise. These are all things you don't have to do, but you'll still be propping the motion, yeah? So you can mech all of those things out. You can say, they'll be taken to a nurse's room after being, like a letter being sent to their parents in advance, so that they can have like a complaints procedure and like to appeal this decision. After that, they'll be taken to the nurse's room where there'll be someone else who will be there to watch, to supervise, to ensure that the beating is not difficult. There'll be strict rules about what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. It will not be conducted by a teacher, but rather like a nurse or another independent member of staff, and it certainly won't be in front of other students. Automatically, OP can't now run. It's humiliating in front of other kids. This creates a perverse incentive where teachers who may want to hit their students get to do that. The kids are going to be like beaten forever, etc., etc. Do you see how you still obviously have a difficult prop because you are propping hitting children, but you've made it, substantially more viable. So that's what you should be trying to mech out. Like things which would cripple you, but which you don't need to defend. The other thing you want to be thinking about is like, where are we setting this in terms of like, don't just assume that everyone's going to be talking about the United Kingdom. If you do just want to talk about the United Kingdom, you need to justify why, or like at least explain, so state that that's what you're doing. The other thing which I think is really important is sometimes it's actually useful to keep your model deliberately vague. Richard, a former Warwick Debate Society president here, and I were speaking at Euros where we had to defend nationalising all EU oil, which, obviously wouldn't work ever. And, we were in prep, we were like, how on earth is this going to work, right? Like, the countries which produce oil aren't just going to give them up. There's nothing you can really give them in return that will make that acceptable. So we essentially, got up and said, words to the effect of, we're going to nationalise this, and it'll be, the countries who suffer the most will benefit the most, and the payment method will be very fair, with the countries who are benefiting the most contributing in equal proportions. In proportionate instalments to how much they're benefiting, and we'll do this over a long period of time, so the benefits manifest in a fair manner, and then we move on. We've essentially said nothing, right? We've not actually explained how it's going to be paid for or anything, but we've at least given ourselves a chance of then when we get attacked to go, look, we cover this in our mechanism, it's going to be fair. So that seems very fair. So yes, of course, that seems very unfair, so of course we're not going to do that. And also, in that particular debate, no one challenged it, right? Because I think a lot of people are like, wait, there's something wrong with this mech, but it wasn't obviously wrong because we hadn't said something ludicrous. We just hadn't said anything, right? But we had said something. So sometimes, if you are in a position where you have to defend something which does look a bit ridiculous, there can be situations where being deliberately vague is useful. You do need to then be prepared for that point of clarification that comes in, where it's like, will you do X or Y? But you can hedge your bets. But that's a rare thing, but just be aware that that is an option. And the other thing is just bear in mind that like the more you narrow a debate, so the more you use a mech to get rid of arguments, the more you narrow the opportunities for you to use particular arguments, right? So for example, say you're legalizing drugs and you make it incredibly difficult for people to get these drugs, then you undermine your argument that this is going to substantially reduce the black market, because if it's still really difficult to get drugs, then people are still going to, who need the drugs, are still probably going to go to the black market. So be aware the impact your model has on your own arguments. But in a nutshell, I would deal with the model at the end of your arguments. So like in the last 2 minutes of prep, go, okay, we have these arguments, what model do we need to facilitate it? Rather than the other way around of going, oh, let's come up with a model and then come up with arguments. Does that make sense? Great. Okay, so Deputy Prime Minister. Sorry, someone had a question? No? Okay. DPM. So, a Deputy Prime Minister's speech, Deputy Prime Minister's role, I describe as being both a guard dog and an attack dog, right? Because what you're doing is, to be honest, 5 things, and this is why it's quite difficult, but a lot of them overlap. So the first thing you want to do is frame. So the start of Deputy Prime Minister's speech is you get up and you explain what the most important issue is in this round. Hopefully you are winning this issue, right? If you're not, pick something else. Or pick that and then win it, right? But by and large, if you've done your work as a team, your Prime Minister has probably done a good job of explaining the most important thing around, the op have probably not been in it comprehensively, and then you can get up and frame around that issue, yeah? We were very clear that the most important thing in this round is to ensure that the most vulnerable people in society have an opportunity not just to make something of their own lives, but also to benefit in the long run to the rest of the community as well. We had very little response from on that claim, right? And then you can move on, yeah? The second thing you want to do is clarify. So there's an important distinction here. Irrespective of what your partner's done, your partner was never confusing or confused. The other team were confused, right? Like, leader of opposition was clearly confused, right? My partner very clearly said that we would pay for the oil by doing the following, right? Does that make sense? Because it's also about, debating is about perceptions, right? You're not getting judged by a robot, more often than not. You're getting judged by people. So if you come across as a defensive team, a team that's kind of like not in control of the round, the team that's confused, the team that's having to clarify, you're less likely to do well than if you can paint yourselves as a confident team who are clear, and it was the other team who were confused, right? Prime Ministers obviously help your Deputy Prime Ministers out by being clear, but if you're not, the DPM should back you up, back you to the hill. Also true, by the way, with whip speakers and their partners. In terms of structure then, you frame. I would then have usually three things I want to talk about. The first 2 will broadly be clashes, but I won't call them that. I just call them, okay, so firstly I want to talk about legitimacy. Secondly, I want to talk about the effect of this policy, right? Essentially, those are clash points. And then I'll clash the top half, okay? And in doing that, I'll defend what my partner said and attack what the other side has said. And then the third thing I'd recommend as well you do, is add a completely new argument in the round, right? And then depending on how well you're beating opening opposition, I'd add a 4th argument. But more often than not, if you can beat opening opposition convincingly, you're going to win the round or come second, right? It's unlikely you're going to get beat by 2 teams. And sorry, so the 4th and 5th thing, so the 4th thing is extend, which we've covered by having a new argument, and the 5th thing is comparative. Always weigh your arguments up against others. No, I have in that structure, I would say that have a maximum of 2 independent points of rebuttal. No more than that. Because you want to, again, portray that you're in control of this round. Everything fits in your criteria, what you want to talk about. If you have 4 or 5 points of rebuttal, which is common in DPM, it doesn't look like you're in control of the debate. Because it looks like you're reacting to the op, rather than them having to react to you. That's not to say don't deal with those arguments, but rather deal with them within your points of clash, which aren't clash, right? Does that make sense? And in response to your own material. So don't just attack theirs, rather go, we said this, or here's a new argument, this is how this beats their argument. And the most important thing, or one of the most important things, that you can do in any position, but it's very useful, and especially to come in the DPM, and so the question I remember right at the start of like, who says what, the thing I'm about to say now should nearly always come in the DPM speech, I think, is provide a metric for the judges to evaluate the round. And what I mean by metric is, why, if everything in this debate was equally well explained, why should we still win? So that's to say, why is it that this group of people matters more than another, or why this outcome matters more than this harm, or why this principle matters more than this effect? and justify that. Because very few teams do that. Very few teams actually explain why, if things were, if their argument was true and yours is true, why theirs is more important than yours. Grand. So I think that broadly covers it. I will send you my notes on this, which have everything I discussed and some other stuff. But yeah, more than happy to take questions.
How do you divide up your arguments if you can't come up with that many arguments? It's like you said, like either between 5 or 6 arguments you devise as government. If say you've only got 4 between the two of you, do you still let the PM take 4 of them and then leave none for the next person?
No, so it's a good question. So I think, and I'm sorry, I don't think I was very clear with this, so this is my fault. I think more often than not, pretty much in all scenarios, you only need 4 arguments, right? But it's about having different reasons for those arguments, and that's where you can spread things out a bit. So, for example, say that we spent the most time talking about universal basic income, and if we believe that those are the 4 burdens in the debate, your DPM shouldn't have to get up and start proving something else, because why would you be proving that? What they can do is, of course, come up with a different reason or argument that proves that. Yeah? So, if after prep, however, you're like, we literally only have 4 things to say, yeah? You need to go, alright, I would still determine, if they are all important and all have to be said, Prime Minister should definitely say them. Because DPM then has all of the Prime Minister's speech, and of course the leader of OP to come up with their own argument. Sometimes what will happen is that OP will get up and say something, you go, oh yes, of course. And then you can flip their argument and come up with a positive version of that for your side. But even if you can't do that and all you end up doing is repeating your partner, and to be honest, the last World Championships I did, that's pretty much all I did. I'm just like, look, we were very clear in the first speech, I'm just going to go through again and say what we said and maybe add one thing. And we did incredibly well on the top half, because by and large, most debates come down to 2, maybe 3 issues, right? So you don't need 5 or 6 arguments or something. But if in doubt, everything goes in the Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister defends what the Prime Minister says. You shouldn't weaken your Prime Minister's speech in order to give the DPM something new. Yes, the DPM might unfortunately be penalised on speaker points, but you'll still get higher team points. Yeah.
How do you frame effectively?
So it's a very good question. There's also a question which, realistically, you could talk about for a very long period of time. What I would say is the most effective way is you want to ask yourself, okay, what for us is the most important issue in this round? Yeah. So in the universal basic income, we seem to agree as a group that the most important issue was preventing people who are in a vulnerable position from being forced to work in order to stave off poverty or homelessness, right? So then go, okay, what can I say that captures that clash? Because we're going to win that clash, right? Because OP are probably going to, if everyone explained everything equally, OP are probably going to be able to explain that some money gets wasted, but you're going to be able to explain that by and large these people benefit more, provided you can explain the total amount of money doesn't completely collapse. So it'd be about, okay, let's focus on that. What's our conception of what will happen compared to the status quo? Let's start with that. That's what this debate's about, and then you frame it in the way I kind of attempted earlier to do. But it's about asking yourself, what is the most important clash in this round, and how can we argue we're winning it, and focus on that. Again, your framing should really only be maximum 30 seconds, because you want to actually go through and explain it. And you don't want to cover everything in your framing, because obviously you're going to have 3 arguments, but you can't frame around all 3 issues. You just want to frame around one. Anything else? No? Great. Thank you very much. To the millions watching at home, thank you. Awesome.